Right. Well, public diplomacy has developed quite a bit since 9/11, 2001, in the sense, first of all, that there are so many more states that take a keen interest in it. It is really a global phenomenon now, with, I should say, particular passion, particular enthusiasm also for the subject and what public diplomacy may achieve in East Asia. What have we seen in developments? We've seen that academia has taken a greater interest in the subject, but has not really managed to develop a theoretical perspective on public diplomacy. There is no such a thing as a theory on public diplomacy. Neither is there an agreed definition. One American colleague of mine did a study where she came to the conclusion that there are about 150 definitional statements of public diplomacy. Now, then it's not surprising for me that foreign policy practitioners tell me it's still rather vague to them, and they're trying to work out how they see public diplomacy. Now, what has changed from the perspective of foreign ministries? It certainly is that they have taken on board a number of ideas from think tanks and academia, and I think that is particularly interesting. For instance, where the old public diplomacy, one could say, was a public diplomacy where foreign ministries perceived the subject as them communicating with foreign audiences, they see a much larger role now for civil society actors that are more credible interpreters and receivers than foreign ministries themselves. So some of those ideas, that less control, more civil society involvement, the involvement of non-governmental actors in your public diplomacy, we can actually witness that those ideas have traveled from the think tank community and academia to foreign ministries. Interestingly, it is think tanks that took the lead here, not so much academic work from, one could say, the ivory tower of academia, but the think tanks in a closer relationship with government have taken the lead here. So there is more of a role for civil society actors. There's more of an idea that there should be true dialogue. It's been emphasized very often by everybody writing on this subject. Listening is important, not just talking, and listening is, of course, part of a dialogue that you have with the unofficial abroad. What has been emphasized rather less in the literature, but I think is quite a key point, is that public diplomacy is part of an overall transformation of diplomacy. It is, so to say, it's epiphenomenal. It's epiphenomenal, meaning it's part of a wider development of diplomacy, becoming more networked, involving more actors, being less state-based. States discover that they are no longer the only players, they're embedded in a network of a whole range of actors. So that public diplomacy, being part of diplomacy, is, I think, an important point to recognize. It is not a bolt-on, it's not a communication trick, it's not something that's added to the practice of decades and hundreds of years before. No, we're in the midst of a transformation of diplomatic practice, which becomes more societized, one could say. Diplomats and foreign ministries have more to do with their domestic society and also with foreign societies, which is actually new to them, as much in democratic states as it is even more so in authoritarian states. So one could say, then again, the bigger picture is public diplomacy is part of foreign policy establishments coming to terms with transnationalization of international affairs. Now, in the past years, foreign ministries have learned a great deal from crises. Individual countries have learned from the crises that happened to them. And in that sense, a lot of that public diplomacy was reactive. There are world-known examples, like, for instance, the cartoon crisis that hit the Danes, and that very much determined their public diplomacy. It was a largely reactive public diplomacy. I could give examples of my own country, the Netherlands, and there are many others. So it was very much a reactive public diplomacy, a public diplomacy that was meant to, if not save the image, nurture the reputation of a country in its unofficial foreign relations. We see more recently, and I think also under the influence of the economic crisis, that countries ask themselves the question, how can public diplomacy become more instrumental in serving broader foreign policy purposes, for instance in the economic field. So we're no longer talking just about image, a good image, but also a public diplomacy that supports commercial trade interests of a country. So that is clearly a link that has been made. Another recent development is that there has been a much greater consciousness of the importance of public diplomacy outside the West. We still see that a lot of the literature on public diplomacy comes from both Europe and the United States. But I think it is vital that now others, and particularly East Asians, join that debate, and that actually to make progress in our understanding of how soft power works, also outside the setting of Europe and North America, it is vital that we get that theoretical, that empirical input, and those lessons based on different life experiences and values. So I could go on about what has changed in recent years, but this, I think, are some of the key points here. With one final one, of course, the role of social media. What is public diplomacy doing? It's trying to get to those places where regular diplomacy cannot reach. As Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian statesman said more than 200 years ago, public opinion reaches the darkest corners. Now, what are those darkest corners in the age of social media? You have to go where people are, and they are indeed in the social media. And so those social media, one could say, give an enhanced representative platform to diplomatic establishments. Where you have an embassy and you are in the capital, in big countries, the social media give you reach far beyond the capital. For the American embassy in Jakarta, for instance, the Americans boast that they have access through the social media to hundreds of thousands of Indonesians. So that is those are significant developments. Also developments that are interesting in relations with states that used to be rather impenetrable. Look, for instance, how embassies, perhaps also the Korean embassy, embassies in Beijing are using Weibo, the Chinese social media, to get access to Chinese society in ways that were unanticipated, unheard of before. So there are broader options that are given to us by social media platforms, and the social media are also changing the role of the individual diplomat. We see how individual ambassadors are on Twitter, they have their own blog, so they become, for ordinary people, they become real people, and they have their personal stories to tell. So for them, the game of diplomacy is becoming also one more out of the orbit of government and all those who are like themselves. When I start talking about either East Asia or Korea, I say up front, I'm not a Koreanist. I'm not specialized in East Asia, so it's important to bear that in mind. But certainly, public diplomacy has complicated traditional great power games. It has given a voice to smaller powers, to middle powers, particularly like Korea, that have something to offer to the region and to the global community as a whole. And so it is not a surprise that the great powers who are themselves investing a lot in public diplomacy. We see that in the US. It is absolutely massive what the State Department has done in that field. It's even more massive what the Chinese are, the effort that the Chinese are putting into that. I had a conference co-organized with a Chinese NGO, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself, in May in Beijing with the Chahar Institute on public diplomacy, and it was absolutely amazing how interested the Chinese are in developing this concept. But when other powers, when the smaller powers do that, they become slightly more unsettled, because small powers then talk about different roles for themselves in the region, like middle power role. Small powers talk about the creation of transparent regional networks, and that is all complicating the role of great powers. It gives a voice to the smaller ones. It gives also a special voice to conversations that can be held through the medium of public diplomacy. To give one example, Indonesia is putting a lot of effort into the Bali Democracy Forum as a regional Asian conversation. So here we see that the issue of democracy, the issue of human rights are put on the agenda not by the West, but by Asian powers themselves. And I think that in the case of China, that there are reasons for concern where like-minded Asian powers, and for Korea there are a whole number of like-minded powers that they may join and discuss issues that become issues on the agenda of their public diplomacy. What's most striking for the outside world is, of course, not how much Korea is investing in public diplomacy, which it is, but how much China is investing in public diplomacy. The fascination with China as a rising power is enormous in Europe, but the Chinese are also having to come to terms with the fact that they cannot control foreign public opinion. And the two case studies of the Olympic Games and the Shanghai Expo are interesting examples where, particularly during the Olympic Games, the Chinese, although they orchestrated a wonderful show, they were not in control of other issues that world opinion was interested in, like the situation in some of the regions, like the China's human rights record. So in East Asia, some powers have to think very hard how to make their public diplomacy successful and to what extent it is actually compatible with their political system. Now, my line would be that public diplomacy is there for all countries, small and big, and is relevant for all political systems. But authoritarian powers have a harder nut to crack. They have a harder nut to crack in the first place because devolution is important. It is important to, and also China realizes that the messages should not just be controlled by central government, but the voice of society, of the regions, of the cities should also be heard. And precisely this civil society participation, which is so essential in making public diplomacy credible, making the voice of a country legitimate in the eyes of the receivers, that's where a country like China has a big job to do, and the Chinese are very keenly aware of that. In a broader sense, I think for East Asia, as for countries elsewhere, there is a realization that the job of the diplomat and diplomacy itself are changing, and that is where the Indian-American thinker Parag Khanna used a very nice comparison. He said actually it is no longer, diplomacy is no longer the stiff waltz. He used the metaphor for dance. It is no longer the stiff waltz among nations. It's more an improvised jazzy dance. That is what diplomacy today looks like. And that is indeed in a more networked international environment where there are many different players, we see that this game of public diplomacy is being played out. Now, when I go back to the first question where you ask what are more general developments in public diplomacy, I think the Asian experience has something to tell to the rest of the world as well. And one of the points to make here is that public diplomacy comes probably more naturally to East Asians as something that is relationship based. It's not something that you project, an image that you project to the rest of the world, but it is it's really based on the nurturing of good long-term relationship building is key in Asia, but in early discussions on public diplomacy in the West, that essential aspect was rather forgotten for some time. I think another characteristic of public diplomacy in Asia is that Asia is more, because of the dissimilar powers, political systems, is more a part of the world that promotes and can promote more successfully the idea of networks, of fluid networks. Networks are, after all, inclusive, despite the differences between the network partners, whereas clubs are exclusive, as international organizations are also. Finally, a brief point to make is that I think that Asian powers, Asian countries can project their ideas through public diplomacy to the global community. But that's perhaps also something, yes, where the Korean experience could come in. Without being an expert on this particular issue, I do believe that public diplomacy could help the Republic of Korea in its global role, in its regional role, and that public diplomacy has a role to perform at home as well, domestically. And this is first of all on a global scale, where we've of course seen a tremendous rise in the confidence of Koreans who are now members of clubs like the G20, the MICs, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea and Turkey, of the next 11 after the BRICS. So Korea is realizing, with some other risers in the global economy, that it's being taken seriously. And countries that are being taken seriously are looked at by the others. And this is the moment to come in with ideas of your own for that wider world, which is a global market of ideas. We're living in a global market of ideas, and that's where also Korea could come in and successfully come in, if it wants to be seen by the rest of the world with good ideas about global issues. If and when, in this case, Korea has special ideas about ODA that have a clear brand made in Korea, that's an export product that could also be exported through public diplomacy. So whether it's about the environment, about non-proliferation, about all sorts of global issues, I think it's in that particular field of what could be called knowledge diplomacy that middle powers can make a great difference. And we've seen in the past how the more traditional middle powers have been successful in that field. One example that springs to mind is how Canada, as a middle power, joined a major coalition in the creation of a treaty against landmines. How also a coalition of middle powers and non-state actors was instrumental in creating the International Criminal Court. So it's really the ideas that matter here for Korea if it wants to play a role on a global scale. And I believe that in that field it would help if Korea looks for alliances with other like-minded powers that are also somewhere in between the great powers and the small powers. Those powers can learn from one another. There is actually still quite a lot of policy sharing and policy transfer to do, and that's where there would also be, I think, an argument for countries in Europe and Korea to work more closely together. Korea, of course, is a cultural magnet, a fantastic cultural magnet within the region. There is a very strong national cultural consciousness and of the long-standing cultural traditions of Korea. The Korean wave was not invented today or yesterday or 10 years ago. These things do not come just like that. Developed over a long time in history. Now that is where I imagine that Korea's public diplomacy role through its cultural diplomacy is strongest in the region. But one could ask the intriguing question here whether Korea could capitalize on that and say, hey, listen, where we have very strong economic links with countries, like with my own country, the Netherlands. There is a flourishing economic relationship, but that is not really sufficiently paralleled by contacts in the sphere of soft power, understanding of one another's societies, of one another's cultures. There is actually still little educational exchange between countries like the Netherlands and Korea. I would be surprised if there would be more than 200 Korean students on an annual basis going to the Netherlands. But that is perhaps also a field. Exchanges are very effective in public diplomacy, where Korean public diplomacy could be more targeted. It could think harder about where do we want to expand our image, where do we want to nurture existing commercial relationships in the soft power field, as other countries are also with their exchanges operating in a very strategic way. And of course, Korea already has cultural institutes, cultural centers in more than 20 countries. So I realize there is quite a lot going on. Well, in the region then, culture is an important vehicle. I also think that what will remain is that where Korea sees for itself a role as middle power, as broker, as mediator, that may be a slightly problematic concept for other countries in the region, just as the whole notion as middle power may not be something that is accepted for others in Asia who do not as easily identify with that themselves. In the regional context, then I believe there is quite a bit to achieve, because clearly international politics is no longer a zero-sum game, and this is where the smaller powers are gaining. In fact, it's what the big powers have experienced, the United States and also China, is that it's so very hard for them to make their soft power match with their rising hard power. Then from the global to the regional to the domestic, on the domestic front, and my knowledge is insufficient of everything what is going on here, but I believe it is very important to realize that there is a domestic dimension to public diplomacy. And once again, that's where, in a sense, Asia is leading the way for some countries in the West. That the domestic dimension, that working with and through your own population to strengthen your international reputation, is something that is quite accepted in a number of Asian countries, whereas in the traditional conception of public diplomacy, that was not the case. That was not sufficiently observed in at least in a number of countries in Europe. So what are elements of the domestic dimension of public diplomacy? It's education about foreign policy, education about what the objectives of Korea are, what it is all about, but also that this education of the population is again not a one-way street. It's not one-way communication from government to civil society, but also an effort by the government to take ideas from civil society back to government, because that's where you get true participation of your civil society in your foreign policy project, which then becomes more credible and carried by the population, by a large part of the population, where ordinary people are sometimes more effective ambassadors than those who are accredited in an embassy and largely spend their lives within the orbit of government. So that domestic dimension is quite critical. I think it's also important that the population has the confidence that there is a role for Korea to play, that there is confidence. From the little bit I've seen in Korea, I've seen how deeply self-critical Koreans are. Well, you have something to be really extremely proud of, whether you measure that with the yardstick of economic performance or what you have achieved as Korea politically or culturally. So that growing confidence, I think, is important for Korea.